The Rebuild series was a game changer. It not only revamped the Neon Genesis Evangelion story, but changed important plot elements, not to mention reworked characters, into more fleshed out versions of themselves. Kaworu Nagisa is no exception, which is why today we're going to analyze his characterization in the Rebuild continuity and see just how his return affected his relationship with Shinji. Hello Funkers, Tony Funk here. And in part 1 of my Understanding Kaworu analysis, I determined Kaworu was a sheltered individual who had been brainwashed to fulfill Cella's plan. His relationship with Shinji then developed innocently as a byproduct of Kaworu's mission. Through Shinji, Kaworu gained an appreciation of humanity and ultimately died so that humanity could continue. One of the biggest takeaways I gathered from Neon Genesis Evangelion was that due to Kaworu's elusive nature, as well as due to the brevity of his interactions with Shinji, I did not perceive Kaworu's intentions to be romantic in nature. After all, Kaworu had only met Shinji for about 24 to 48 hours before his death. In the Rebuild series, however, things are different. For some unexplained reason, the events of the end of Evangelion trigger a time loop that persisted until the end of Thrice Upon a Time. This meant that by the time the Rebuild series rolled around, Kaworu was no longer naive enough to obey Cella's orders. But not only that, Kaworu was given the opportunity to know Shinji and establish a deep, albeit one-sided relationship with him. In order to analyze how Kaworu's reason to be, and by extension his relationship with Shinji changed in between Neon Genesis Evangelion and the Rebuild series, we must take a close look at the details left for us in all 4 films. We first meet Kaworu in the first film of the series, after Shinji and Rei defeat Ramiel. The camera pans to the moon and we get a scene of Kaworu emerging from one of many coffins. What's interesting is that the first thing Kaworu says is, "Let me guess, the boy has awakened." The phrasing is interesting because it implies that whatever had just happened in Shinji's life constituted his awakening. The implication here then is that Shinji and Kaworu are linked, and Kaworu's awakening from the coffin corresponds with a particular moment in Shinji's life. Another interesting tidbit that we learn about Kaworu during the moon scene is that unlike his Neon Genesis Evangelion counterpart, he does not want the third impact to happen. This is evidenced by him saying, "Not the third again, you never change, do you?" the moment he turns around and sees Mark 6. When he says third again, we know he is not referring to the third children Shinji, but rather the third impact. We know this because Kaworu follows this up by saying he looks forward to meeting Shinji, which invalidates his disappointment when he references this third thing happening again. It also coincides with him seeing Mark 6, which is an EVA unit that eventually plays a role during the near third impact in between 2.2 and 3.3. Kaworu, having already experienced this scenario before, expresses disappointment that Mark 6 was going to be employed again for the implementation of Cella's third impact. The last thing Kaworu says before the film ends is that he looks forward to meeting Shinji, which meant he always had a positive relationship with him during the many time loops he experienced up until that point. So what we've learned from 1.1 is that Neon Genesis Evangelion was actually the first timeline, given that then, Kaworu was willing to obey Cella and follow through with their scenario up until he realized Gendo had tricked everyone. However, in 1.1, after experiencing different timelines including the Neon Genesis Evangelion timeline, Kaworu expressed his disdain for Cella's plan in attempting yet another third impact. We can now assume that Neon Genesis Evangelion was the timeline that Kaworu was created in, which means that in that timeline he did not emerge from a coffin on the moon. We can then imply that the time loop started as a result of the third impact during the end of Evangelion. The importance of this lore, however, lies in the fact that Kaworu from the Rebuild series has had the time to experience life as a human significantly longer than Kaworu from Neon Genesis Evangelion. This now leads me to Kaworu's depiction in 2.2. Kaworu is first seen briefly during Fuyutsuki and Gendo's trip to Tagba base. We learn that at this point neither Gendo nor Fuyutsuki know Kaworu, as they express surprise when they see him. Kaworu then looks at Gendo and says, "Nice to finally meet you, father," implying that he sees Gendo as a father figure, which means that Gendo played a role in creating Kaworu during the second impact of Neon Genesis Evangelion, before Cella took custody of him. This nuance about Kaworu's relationship to Gendo reinforces the similarities between Shinji and Kaworu, with Kaworu representing Shinji's shadow. The next time we see Kaworu in 2.2, he stops the third impact as per Cella's instructions with the Spear of Cassius. Here he states, "At last, the appointed time has come, Shinji Ikari," claiming that Shinji's awakening was foreseen and in fact part of Cella's scenario, this being the last time Cella's plan coincided with Kaworu's intentions. Then he adds, "And this time, I'll make sure you're happy no matter what." telling us that Rebuild Kaworu's sole purpose is to make Shinji happy through every single time loop, as opposed to Neon Genesis Evangelion Kaworu, who initially wanted to follow Cella's orders and wipe out the Lilin. This now leads me to talk about 3.3. In this film, we get to see Kaworu as a main character as opposed to a cryptic exposition cameo. Here we learn more about his personality and how it contrasts with his depiction in Neon Genesis Evangelion. For starters, we learn that Kaworu is capable of human emotions when he states, "Music is fun," and seems to really enjoy himself while playing a piano duet with Shinji. This means that after living multiple lives at this point in the story, Kaworu had finally learned to be human. We also get an interesting scene meant to allude to Kaworu's infinite existence that tells us about Kaworu's goals. During Kaworu and Shinji's second duet, Shinji asks on how to improve on the piano, to which Kaworu states, "Practice and more practice. Repeat the same thing over and over again. Keep going until you're happy with it. It's the only way." This alludes to the fact that Kaworu is also repeating the same thing over and over again until he's happy with the end result. This admission adds further evidence for the idea that Kaworu is trying to make a timeline that would finally give Shinji the happiness he deserves. During Shinji and Kaworu's stargazing scene, Kaworu states, "I really was born to meet you," a parallel to Kaworu's phrase in the original series, where he states that maybe he was born to meet Shinji after all. This change in the dialogue indicates that after experiencing the time loop and meeting Shinji multiple times, that Kaworu has accepted the fact that he's in love with Shinji. My evidence for this comes from the fact that in this continuity, Kaworu's entire raison d'être, or reason to be, is to bring Shinji happiness. This to me suggests that Kaworu's universal view of the greater good is no longer his motivation to do anything, but instead, it's his personal love for Shinji. This means that in the original phrase, "Maybe I was born to meet you," Kaworu referenced the beginning of his conflictions in obeying Cella. Yet in 3.3, Kaworu was confirming to himself that meeting Shinji was more than an opportunity to love humanity, but rather the whole point of his existence. From this point forward, we realize that every action Kaworu takes, from taking Shinji to the scene of the near third impact, to planning to override Gendo's fourth impact, stems from a desire to make Shinji happy for every loop he gets to meet him in. This is confirmed in 3.0 plus 1.01, when Shinji receives the Spear of Gaius, and Kaworu offers to take the reins of Shinji's scenario. Here he asks him what he wishes for, and Shinji states he wishes to save everyone starting with Asuka. But once Shinji releases Asuka to go with Kensuke, Kaworu asks him if he'll be lonely, showing concern about Shinji's future happiness, and perhaps even suggesting himself as a possible replacement for Asuka. But the biggest evidence for this comes from Kaworu's dialogue with Ryoji Kaji, where Kaworu states that he mistook Shinji's happiness when Shinji claimed that he wanted to get rid of the Evas and start anew. Kaji then stepped in and told Kaworu that he had conflated his own happiness with Shinji's happiness. He then adds that Kaworu wanted Shinji to be happy because that would make Kaworu happy as well. The subtext of this is that Kaworu wanted intimacy with Shinji by being his source of comfort, mistaking that as Shinji's end-all be-all, to live a fulfilled life. This is why Kaworu was surprised that Shinji wasn't crying after releasing Asuka, and even being able to see things for the way they were. Kaworu later states, "I see, you have grown up, haven't you? I'll miss how you were before, but this is fine too." By saying this, Kaworu confirms that he'll miss the version of Shinji that seeks reassurance in him, but that he accepts the new Shinji, who would rather brave negative emotions in order to seek a resolution, instead of seeking emotional comfort. And that's the last we see of Kaworu until the train scene. So, what do all these scenes mean? Essentially, these dialogues confirm the idea that through endless iterations of reality, Kaworu became attracted to Shinji. Of course, initially because of his similarities to him, as evidenced in 3.0 plus 1.01, when Kaworu confesses, "I'm like you, that's why I was attracted to you." But for Kaworu to forsake the fate of mankind, allowing an endless loop of incessant battles with angels, just to have the opportunity to spend time with Shinji, suggests romantic attraction. My evidence for this is that if Kaworu cared for Shinji in a platonic sense, he would attempt to use instrumentality to set Shinji as well as everyone free from having to live through an era that relied on militarized children. The reason he hadn't, as explained by Ryoji Kaji, is because he wanted to be Shinji's comfort throughout the entire ordeal, assuming Shinji wanted the same thing. This, then, cannot be platonic love, but rather passionate, romantic love. Every depiction of Kaworu in the Rebuild series, then, consisted of clues pointing to the fact that the only thing Kaworu ever wanted was to be close to Shinji. The ambiguity of the original series, then, was answered without a shadow of a doubt. Though the rebuild cemented what the future of Kaworu and Shinji's relationship would have become, we had known for decades that this was their fate had things turned out a little bit different. Official video games and merchandise have depicted Kaworu as being romantically linked with Shinji since the original series concluded. One example is Kaworu's character overview from the Neon Genesis Evangelion 2 video game, which was created with direct input from Anno himself. And I quote, "While his feelings of love for Shinji are strangely strong, his romantic affections towards members of the opposite sex, such as Ritsuko and Maya, are weak. Could this be because he's an angel? Under these circumstances, forming a Rabu-Rabu relationship with Shinji is preferable. As the relationship is satisfactory, concern over forming other relationships is unnecessary." Rabu-Rabu, of course, meaning the state of being in love with each other. Having said that, none of these iterations of Kaworu contradict his previous depiction as an asexual ethereal being, but simply expanded upon it. Kaworu, having had the ability to experience life with Shinji over eons, not only helped him learn to become more human than in his original depiction, but it also gave way to an emotional attachment more profound than sympathy, a love more personal than ever before. So ultimately, Kaworu may still be asexual, as that is something that cannot change, but he's not aromantic. This means that within the context of the Rebuild series, we can still claim Kaworu is gay, due to his homoromantic feelings for Shinji, as being gay and asexual are not mutually exclusive. So by that token, Kawoshin is very much canon. Thanks everyone for watching, and let me know what y'all think in the comments below. I'd like to give a special thanks to Citrine K for giving me some great sources for the making of this video. And as always, take care, and I shall see yas down the road.